so much, Vicky, and thanks to everybody for coming today. It's great to be back with you all. Wearing a slightly different hat, but as we explore this question of the nexus between applied and critical democracy, or applied and critical digital humanities and democracy, it's one thing that's really interesting for this particular audience is that we explore this question of what the digital humanities is doing in the project about AI, big data, and democracy. And the reason why this all exists, I say, would be a very DARIAH story. Because the origins of KT4D really go back to discussions we would have had at the time of the Sundari project, which some of you may remember, which was a very early starting infrastructure community that was very strongly linked to DARIAH. And one of the things that we learned in that project was that a lot of the conversations going on were not so, they weren't functioning very well, let's put it that way. They had difficulties around certain terminology in that interdisciplinary space that is the digital humanities, and I think particularly of the word data, where we would have all these conversations about what one person understood was data, and the other person said, oh, you please give me your data. I'm happy to give you your data. No, you need to give me your data. It went on and on until we realized that what we had was boundary objects, to use Listar's term, that not only weren't functioning, but actually they seemed designed to not function. They seemed like false boundary objects. So this idea that we would have interdisciplinary conversations, especially at the connection between culture and technology, that wouldn't be working was really at the heart of the KPlex project. This was a project that involved a very small number of partners, but including friends from Danz and from the Freie Universität, and really very strong kind of DARIAH partners. And the outcomes of that, where we realized what a cultural perspective had to bring to the study of big data, is really what brought us into the desire to apply for and eventually get the funding that became KT4D. So again, if you think in terms of your own work, this is a really interesting way of taking a casual conversation and a frustration that comes out of an infrastructure project and bringing it into this sort of applied, outward-facing technology development way. But let me tell you a little bit more about the structure and the positioning of KT4D before we go into kind of two examples that will tell you a little bit about how we work in the project. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about stuff that I'm taking from our policy brief. And you can see it there. It's in our Zenodo community, which I think the link is available for later on in the presentation. The foundational understanding within KT4D is that we need to understand the relationship between AI, big data, and democracy as one that is mediated by culture. There are a lot of attempts to innovate and intervene into the democracy space with AI and big data that seem to forget that there is this whole complex layer of how people react and how they're primed to react by the way in which they connect to each other through the subtle mechanisms of culture. And if you look at the terminologies that we see around AI and big data development and what we want from it, we want it to be human-centered, values-aligned, privacy-protecting, trustworthy. These are all very cultural concepts, and they're ones that sometimes get kind of papered over as things that we can instill in technology systems without actually appreciating that cultural aspect. So we take that kind of cultural lens as meaning something slightly different from what you'd see as a kind of a sociological or maybe a political or economic lens, looking at that level beneath the observable, level beneath the institutions, the level at which people are interacting almost without knowing it. And again, I find this graphic quite useful as a way of communicating what I mean when I talk to people about why culture is a slightly different thing to look at than society, because values, knowledge and stories, traditions and rituals, tools and objects, people will get the arts. But a lot of those other levels are things that they don't realize are strong predictors and strong primers of how we respond to certain technological systems and how we respond to certain kinds of democratic threats and opportunities. But they are very much there, and they are very much at work in the kinds of things that we see. So the third thing, again, I want to kind of bring to you from this sort of policy brief perspective is the way in which we feel that a project taking this cultural approach can actually have a different impact than one that was taking an approach specifically from a technology point of view or from a democratic theory point of view. So we look at this kind of balance between culture on the one hand, where control is distributed. It's always kind of hard to talk about control within culture. It's more influence than control, which is very flexible and adaptable over time, and which most individuals would perceive as a part of their own identity, something internalized. On the other side, we have the world of technology development, where there's a kind of a centralized control, where the knowledge is clustered, which is fast changing, but not necessarily adaptable in the same way as culture, and which is perceived by many not as a part of their identity, but a kind of a consumerist choice. Now, whether it is actually in reality a consumer choice, or whether it is a kind of a statement of identity, or whether one can actually make a strict differentiation between those two is another question. But between these two very different systems, we see that there are a lot of opportunities for what we call control. And we don't mean that in terms of, some kind of great authority, but more in the way of a kind of almost a Germanic interpretation of the word control, in that looking to see what's happening and seeking to maximize benefit without necessarily bringing in undue additional bias. There are ways in which we can create that criticality, that observability within these systems. That is something that a digital humanities, or indeed a humanities cultural-based approach, can bring. And we look at that in the context of this democratic practice and civic participation, and really against some of the things that we see in terms of technosolutionism, which I guess has also come out more recently. There's some very interesting work, and in fact, Eleonora put me onto, about the idea that we're entering into a third wave of AI ethics, and that the second wave of AI ethics was all about trying to create technological solutions to ethical problems, and that we may be moving beyond that to look at AI and big data as part of larger systems, as threats to a kind of a sustainability position, as things that are being entered into cultural systems without necessarily being in line with the values and practices that are already pre-existing in those systems. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to provide this kind of filter, this point of observation, and I'll really come back to that when I talk about the case study of our digital democracy lab. So when we boil this down to how that kind of policy level perspective is in operation in the KT4D project, you can see how these three things are interacting and kind of gearing against each other, where you have the technological advancement on one hand, sociocultural change on the other, and then you have these controls that are predicting the speed and the nature and the trajectory of the changes there. So what we really want to be able to do is to build upon technological affordances, but manage the constraints, not just in terms of what the software can and can't do, but also in terms of the incentives and the values that underlie those systems. So what are the business models? What are the economic drivers? These are all a part of what we see within that gear position of the technological advancement. We also look at the fact that you cannot disentangle technology from culture. Culture it kind of influences technology, and technology influences culture. We have that co-creative helix between the two. However, and I'm kind of I riff a lot off Sheila Jasanoff these days. It seems to be where I am in my career. The fact that there are power relationships in play here, I think, is very important to remember, and those power relationships can sometimes be quite dominating and lead to the idea of culture being hacked, not just being influenced, but being hacked for the interests of particular individuals, for the interests of particular positions. So this is where we see these controls as available at multiple levels. And within the project, we came up with a way of looking at this as through three kind of lenses that we could look at, where we could prime innovation that would bring the technological development in line more with the kinds of values we would see in democratic systems. We would bring education in to help individuals develop a kind of a critical digital literacy, not that we felt that it was entirely their responsibility to gate the technologies they were using, because obviously the technologies are designed to be used a particular way, and that's not always clearly communicated to the users, but that they could actually be more empowered to make more informed choices about the technology they use and why. And then in between, there is this gear of regulation, which is where we can see the control come from. And we think, control with a big C in terms of regulation, policy, GDPR, AI Act, all that, but also regulation with a very small r, regulation with a big C and a small r, where we look at the kind of the self-regulation that might come from the development of new kinds of values and ethics within the culture of software design and development. And this is something that Eleonora is going to speak more about. So we have these three perspectives and these three kind of keywords that we talk about as the angles and the vectors from which we feel that our project can make a significant contribution to discussions of big data, AI, and democracy. There's a couple of other things, though, just to kind of let you know about the structure of the project. So first of all, we are very, very close to a set of users. We have 4 groups of users, 2 of which are kind of citizen-facing or citizen-facing CSOs. One of which is a group of policymakers, one of which is aimed at academic and industrial software developers. And they're based in different places, and there's different linguistic regimes and different professional identities involved there. But it's really important to remember that we're looking very much towards these different roles and these different kinds of individuals as our, I don't want to say target markets, but as the people that we want to validate the work that we're doing. And for these groups, we have these key exploitable results, KERs or KERs as they are spoken of these days. And today we're going to be talking a bit more about 2 of these KERs. One, the social computing compass for self-assessment, which is what Eleonora was speaking about. And then I'll talk a little bit about our digital democracy lab. And you can see how they have slightly different positionings within the project, but we're going to be focusing a lot on this use case 4, in part because it's the one we know best, because it's run in the city of Dublin, where we're both professionally based, but it's also one that I think is quite interesting for this group. So one other thing to kind of bring you into the loop on the structure of the project, we also have this thing called the Cultural Risk Toolkit or the Social Risk Toolkit, which is a series of kind of foundational knowledge chapters. So we have this very, very large deliverable that talks about different things like trust. It talks about incentives in the system. It talks about participatory ML. So there's a number of different issues we felt we needed to have a kind of a shared understanding of. And one of the most interesting, again, for this group would be component C of that particular large deliverable, which would be the one about looking at historical precedents. In other words, how is it that we can look at the present moment of challenge to democracy from AI and big data? And can we see that there are things we can learn from the past? Are there things that we can bring in and say, okay, well, at this point in time, when the telephone was introduced, when cinema was introduced, when photography was introduced, there were similar challenges. And this is how culture adapted. How can we learn from that now? What is different? So we can look at things like agency, and we can look at historical change, and we can look at the ways in which there are perhaps oppression and anti-democratic tendencies in some of these technologies, and kind of use that as part of the knowledge base that we bring into all of our more use case facing activities. Won't go into this too deeply, but again, if you have questions about this, I'm sure Eleonora, who's done most of the work on this, would be very happy to come in on that and the question period. So the 2 things we are going to talk about today are, first of all, this idea of critical digital literacy and how it's not just for school kids, that we do need people who can look critically at technology, but again, not just when they are young and learning, but at all points in their life, but also as citizens and also as professionals. And then we're also going to look at this question of moving from the kind of the human in the loop to the humanities in the loop, or the humans in the loop, to this kind of sense of the collective and the idea of democracy in the loop, which our partners DemSoc have been developing. So I'm going to stop sharing here and turn over to Eleonora for the next section of the presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay. Okay, so yes, I will be talking about one of the output for this project, which is the Social Computing Compass tool. The Social Computing Compass tool is an easy-to-use gamified resource for software developers working in academia and in industry. And we are designing it to encourage a deeper level of self-reflection about the impact of AI software design on civic and democratic participation. And we have two main objectives with this tool. First, we want to enable developers to make granular and culturally sensitive decisions about their coding practices. And second, we are working to encourage culturally aware approaches to AI innovation in democratic context. So our original proposal was to create some sort of checklist, but in the course of interacting with our project target user group in an early co-creation process that I am going to discuss, we discovered that we could effectively use serious gaming to encourage a more ethical approach to software design. So our choice to develop a narrative-based serious game rather than a simple checklist is rooted in the critical digital humanities approach that underpins the entire project. So we are offering something different from many other existing tools, and there are two principles, or rather approaches, that we adopt and that I will be discussing today. First is the need to go beyond ethics, so to include culture. And this is an essential step in recognizing the complexity of the socio-technical systems that AI create. And this approach applies humanistic research modes to the evaluation of AI, a field that currently is dominated by ethics and philosophy and not very much by the humanities and cultural studies. The second point in designing our serious narrative game is that we are guided by the understanding of narrative as an important contributor to people's empowerment. In other words, we are interested in narrative as agency, specifically a form of agency that, because it is speculative, allows for a more nuanced and critical understanding of the issues at stake. And in this case, the cultural impact of AI systems and why developers should care about it. But before discussing these two principles, I just want to give you a brief overview of what the game will look like, more or less, and what is guiding our decision for its design. And bear in mind that this game will be submitted over 1 year from now, so we are still toying with different ideas. So to create a tool that responds to developers' real needs and workflow, we are partly basing our design on the findings of a workshop that we organized last year in October 2023 at Trinity College Dublin. And this workshop involved developers from in and outside of academia, and it provided us with very important inputs, allowing us to test our preliminary assumptions. So our preliminary assumptions were the following. First, we expected communicating the need for professional understanding of computer ethics among developers to be difficult. Also, we expected ethical checklists to be the norm among software developers, and we assumed that this was an approach that they were comfortable with. And finally, we imagined that to consider all aspects forming users' identity, gender, race, religion, culture, etc., would be viewed as equally challenging by developers. So several issues emerged during the workshop, and we got very useful feedback, and I just want to summarize the most crucial one for our developing of this tool. So first, communicating the need for ethics in software development is indeed extremely difficult. And in light of this, we concluded that the best targets for our tool will be university programs and HR departments. Also, differently from what we imagined, checklists do not work, and nor do competitive games. Instead, our participants suggested narrative and collaborative games, and some mentioned Dungeons and Dragons as an example. And because these games are more nuanced and complex than any gamified checklist. And lastly, participants were quite comfortable considering and including intersectionality in their work. So gender and racial identity, different professional and social roles of the users. Instead, multiculturality was described as extremely difficult to understand and to embed in software development. So the two last points, people's preference for narrative games and developers struggle with culture more than with identities, are the two pieces of feedback that informed our decision to first opt for a narrative game based game instead of a checklist, and focus on culture as an integral part of ethics in AI systems. So based on the feedback that we received, we decided on three main features that we want for our tool. First, granularity. Our game is based on the granularity of coding decisions rather than high-level ethical principles. Openness. Our game shouldn't provide answers or solutions, but aims at highlighting complexities. It needs to show how to be critical and vigilant, which are skills needed in different contexts and circumstances. And last, immersive experience. The game should provide an immersive and unsettling experience, which would be more effective and engaging than gamified checklists, as I already said. So with this in mind, we have designed an initial scenario for our game, and I just want to walk you through it very briefly. So the story is this. A company has created an AI-supported platform to be used by high school students instead of regular social media. When the game begins, the company is about to lose its contract with the school because several serious incidents occurred, which are ascribable to the platform. The player, who can be either an employee of the company or an external consultant, we still need to decide, needs to investigate what happened and what specific mistakes were committed at various stages of the development. During this detective narrative game, the player learns that the company did follow ethical guidelines and recommendations such as participatory machine learning, content moderation to block hateful speech, human-in-the-loop approach, and so on. Nonetheless, things went horribly wrong because cultural issues were ignored. Let me just give you one example from the scenario to explain what we mean by this. So during the game, the players learn that the system was developed in consultation with parents and teachers, and meetings with developers occurred before the platform was released. So participatory machine learning and inclusivity were considered and implemented. However, several parents did not attend the meetings, and this is because they belong to a minority group that has originally been oppressed, and the school is run by members of the dominant group, like seen as the oppressors. So when invited to the consultation meetings with the company, the parents did not attend because they did not feel welcomed or included, and therefore their opinion was not accounted for. And these later caused issues for which the company is being held accountable. So in showing how these oversights not only harm democratic and civic participation, but also cause economic loss and reputational damages for the companies, we hope to reach developers and HR departments who might otherwise be not interested in fostering cultural awareness and sensitivity. So this is the overview of how the game will look like. But what is different about this tool that we are designing compared to other existing one aimed at helping developers with AI ethics? The difference is that our tool advances cultural awareness rather than focusing just on universal human values. And why do we focus on cultural awareness beyond the usual approach to AI ethics? Because like machine learning and AI-based predictions are possible because the world has regularities. However, culture often defies these regularities. Culture is made of differences which matter greatly for democracy. And our goal is to offer a tool that encourages developers to consider and respect cultural differences and specificities. In other words, we want software developers to understand how their decisions regarding technical aspects are received differently depending on the cultural values and identities of the communities who adopt those systems. So if we design AI system and platform that neglects these cultural aspects, these can have a tragic impact on the political life of countries. And a perfect example of this can be found in what happened famously in 2017 in Myanmar, when the Rohingya people were killed, tortured, raped, and displaced in the thousands as part of the Myanmar campaign of ethnic cleansing. In the months and years leading up to these atrocities, famously, Facebook's algorithms were spreading hateful messages, which contributed to real-world violence. And one of the reasons why Facebook failed to act was that it did not employ content moderators speaking the local language, Burmese. So no one was able to understand and to block the messages inciting violence. And indeed, Mark Zuckerberg admitted that failing to understand culture caused this tragedy. In 2018, during his US Senate hearing, Zuckerberg declared, and I'm quoting, "Hate speech is very language specific. It's hard to do it without people who speak the local language, and we need to ramp up our effort there dramatically." So the game that we are creating aimed precisely at helping software development avoiding this tragic oversight due to the inability to understand the cultural dimension of their work. Another thing that I want to discuss that Jennifer is already mentioned is how our approach aligns with what researchers are now calling the third wave of AI ethics. And this is a structural approach that goes beyond technical solutions to analyze deeper power structures. This isn't about creating efficient technological fixes for discrete problems, but it's about understanding technologies as part of a larger socio-technical systems. And previously, AI ethics, what is called the second wave of AI ethics, focus on artifact level discussions and technical solutions. So for instance, how to curate better, more inclusive data set on which to train AI models, or how to assess and review algorithmic system, what is known as algorithmic auditing. And these are all solutions that focus specifically on the technical level. The third way of AI ethics instead demands a more holistic perspective, which is in line with our critical digital humanities approach. So we are asking developers to take a step back and to see their work not just as code, but as a complex cultural intervention. And now to my last point, narrative as agency. So I already explained how, based on the feedback that we received, why we opted for a narrative serious game. And this allows us not only to develop something potentially more engaging and fun, but also to draw from the principle of narrative agency and use it to our advantage to challenge some of the preconception around AI ethics that many developers might have due to their familiarity with other more traditional tools that perhaps their HR departments or project manager have introduced to them. So Anna Meretoja describes narrative agency as our ability to understand how underlying stories shape our actions, sense of self, view of the future. It also involves having the power to choose which story we follow and how we tell our own story about life, relationship, and the world. The concept of narrative agency was, as you all know, first developed within the field of narrative studies and later entered the discussion on interactive games because it offers a solution to an overly simplified understanding of agency as the free will of the players. So, according to this approach, agency in interactive games is way more than simply being free to explore the next room or choose your own magic weapon. And the concept of narrative agency applied to the design of serious games offer us two things. First, it defines sense making as a narrative practice rooted in culture. And this is in line with our understanding of culture as the filter through which people adopt, reject, and make sense of technologies, AI included. Secondly, the concept of narrative agency recognizes narrative performance as a polyphonic collective process involving contrasting opinions and point of view. And this has to do with the fact that both narrative and agency are positional because they depend on people's cultural values, personal and professional identities, access to knowledge, and more. And this is a central proposition in the design of our game because within the same game, we want to speak to programmers working in different contexts and at different levels. For us to choose one specific target, for example, entry-level programmers versus senior tech company employees with managerial responsibility would mean to narrow the scope of our tool, but also to overlook the collective and conflictual negotiation behind AI design. So by placing culture, narrative, and human experience at the center of software design, we encourage developers to push beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries, something that digital humanities does very well. And with this, I'll hand it over to Jennifer to present the second example from our project.
Sorry, just resharing the slides there. So the second example we wanted to talk to you briefly about, and again, we can take questions at the end if you want us to go into any more aspects of this in any more depth, would be this idea of the Digital Democracy Lab. This was our sort of central point for making the case that our project was pushing forward some form of innovation, that we were actually engaging with these tools as more than epiphenomenon. I mean, we were actually working in and through AI and big data. So the objective really was with this to create an innovative system deployment of AI and big data. And it's very interesting to have seen how this is developed quite differently from the other projects that were funded under the same call from the European Commission. We were all gathered together in an interesting European Commission sort of way into a task force. So I know very well what every other project is developing. And they are much more about end-to-end platforms and much more about something where you would put some kind of human intelligence in and be able to pull some kind of human intelligence forming material out. Ours is quite different. You'll first of all notice that we have two of these key exploitable results that are associated with the Digital Democracy Lab. One is the demonstrator platform. That is the software platform that is developed by our partner Hybrid Core, in which and through which people experience this ecosystem of working through AI and big data to approach a civic participation task. But we also have this handbook, which is unique in the entire consortium, because this is about the optimal practical, ethical, and technical conditions for using that system. It's about the breaks and fissures and the way in which we want to see this system actually taken on into a human metabolism. And there's three kind of design principles that are really worthwhile to bear in mind here. First of all, the lab and the demonstrator together were designed to afford what we call democratic stewardship of the technology. And, I'm saying we, but I really have to give an awful lot of credit to our KT4D partners, Democratic Society, or DemSoc, who really were able to develop this ethical and imaginary and design set of paradigms that drive this lab experience and this sort of lab as a concept. One of the things they developed was this idea that, well, we have the idea of the human in the loop, which works to a certain extent. And there's also been people who've put forward the idea of society in the loop, which is something more about humans, not as atomized individuals, but as ones that share interdependencies and values. But the idea that democracy in the loop would be the next iteration of this, that there would be an idea of democratic intervention points, of frictions in the technology, and I'll come back to this idea of meaningful friction in a minute, that would encourage negotiations and adjustments of parameters in a way that was responding to the needs and wants of the human agents. So the idea was to bring that democratic intervention points in and aim for technologies that could engage in these democratic processes, but also beyond that. The second aspect of the design principles I want to highlight is that it really had to be something that added value. Again, you see a lot of these systems being developed that become places where the discourse can take place, but don't necessarily add value over current approaches. One of the things, however, is that to approach this idea of how and why does an AI big data system add value to democratic exchange or civic participation, we found that was quite difficult and quite speculative, in particular as democracy is in itself inherently messy. It is not a neat, tidy, straightforward process. It wanders and it curves and it kind of comes back upon itself. And how would we square that with the idea of this technological value of system efficiency? In order to be able to test any of this, we had to find a case study in which we'd be looking at the way in which these technologies could support informed conversation and deliberation. And just for your information, the case study we actually ended up choosing was one about transition of the labor market, something that was close enough to the real issue at hand, which was how the system worked, but far enough away that it wouldn't become a referendum on the system, but that people would actually engage with the questions they were being asked. And then the final of these sort of design processes that we were looking at was the idea that opacity is part of the problem with many of these systems, and that to overcome this opacity would be one of the main goals of this digital democracy lab. So the fact that we would have these concerns that when decisions are being made by a system where we don't necessarily even know how or why it gives the output it does, we needed to make sure all of that was visible. We needed to make sure, again, to use DemSoc's term, that the AI metabolism could be understood by the users. And this meant bringing all of these parameters out, from the data to the tagging to the profiling. Note that in every one of these principles, our focus remained ever on the enhancement of human capacity, not system capability. Again, a difference between our project and some of the others that we work in parallel with. So essentially, and I'm sorry that I don't have any pictures of the lab being delivered, but these experiences were just carried out in the past about 6 weeks. So it's all very new for us, but the labs have been delivered now, and the success was really interesting. The ways in which people responded and the ways in which some groups really wanted to talk about the technological aspects, even when they were kind of citizen groups, the way in which the trust to the organization delivering the lab made a difference in the conversation, the way in which we segmented the lab in different ways, which is one thing I will talk more about. But I just want to kind of show you how in this metabolism, there were sort of 3 loops for the participants. The first loop was about engaging with the training data. So we did not use personal data. The ethical risks were a little bit too high for that, and the idea that we would actually be potentially doing exactly the kind of thing we didn't want to see people doing was very forward in our mind. So what we used for training data was essentially published work, newspaper ads, not newspaper ads, but newspaper articles and the like, which represented different positions towards this question of transition of the labor market. So that was the first technological module that the participants were encouraged to look at, critique, understand, explore, ask questions about. From those was a set of semi-automated profiles. And these profiles, again, were developed drawing from the training data, but also vetted by the folks at DEMSOC to make sure that they aligned to a kind of a human readable and human oversight of the way in which profiles are generated. Again, we didn't want to just fall back onto that automated profiling. And then the third loop was using the participants' knowledge of where they fit according to the profiles and also where the data for the system was drawn from to actually generate a policy position and to use the prompting that we all know from generative AI in order to progress that forward. Now, this wasn't an off-the-shelf ChatGPT. It was actually a trained chatbot that was meant to draw out from these profiles and from the training data using RAG techniques in order to improve that. But again, it was more the opportunity for individuals to see and validate how they felt about this being used in a sensitive policy context than it was to actually have the product at the end be something that could then be put into use. And just to give you a sense of what this was like in context, so as I mentioned, we had different kinds of conversations with different cohorts. The lab was run over 2 hours in some cases, over 4 hours in some cases, over almost a full day in others. It was really very much something that we needed to adapt to not just the needs and the level of previous knowledge, but also the language and the cultural conditions and even the political conditions. In one case, in particular in Poland, we were very sensitive about the timing of this around certain kinds of political and election movements. So there were things that we had to really keep in mind. And one of the ways in which we did that, for example, with our software designers was to look at this concept of meaningful friction. And if you're unfamiliar with the idea of meaningful friction, there's a really short, great video to introduce it to you that I give the link to there. But essentially, it's about the idea that sometimes with designed objects, we need more friction in the system to be able to actually encourage people to stop and think, whether that is your email says the word attachment, did you forget to attach something to that? Or, as in the example here, whether people are able to better dose from pills if they are in a blister pack rather than an open bottle. So that kind of thing really let us dig into this question of, in a system like this, where can the frictions be? Because there are a lot of frictions. There are frictions between the different identities we bring to the use of technology. We may want something different as a professional than we do as a consumer. We may want something different as a parent than as we do as somebody who lives in a particular community or neighborhood. So there are many different hats that we engage with, and it's important to remember and to make sure that we instigate an awareness of that holistic identity when we do that. And in terms of that holistic identity, one of the things that we came very, very strongly to believe is that even though we are a European project, we can't ever assume that Europe is one thing. The political conditions, the social conditions in Warsaw and Madrid, where two of our case studies were taking place, are very different. And it was important for us to be able to reflect that, in particular in this year of elections. And we also felt that this was a great opportunity to develop new understanding, new positions of consensus, new forms of understanding for requirements. And I just put a little quote there from some work by Magern Katzenbach about a project called the Museum of Random Memory, where it was really found that the participants really had a hard time getting past the ideologies that they had already sort of invested in terms of technology, that they really couldn't see past the technologies that they were using to see towards the kind of power structures that were behind them. And of course, that is sort of the humanities input par excellence, I think, to most things. So just a final note to wrap this up above and beyond that last case study. The idea that the KT4D project can embrace this mess that is technology, that is democracy, that is the way we interact through culture, is really important to us. And it comes down to this idea of how we instigate collective sense-making, not just individual sense-making, but collective sense-making, informed sense-making into technological adoption questions as a counterweight to that consumerist role we're encouraged to take on. So this is why the use cases are so important to us and so important for helping us to explore this set of regional and professional cultural differences that we think need to become a part of the policy that guides the way in which these are developed. If you read the AI Act, you'll find that the word market shows up hundreds of times, but the word culture shows up maybe, I think it was 3. So how can we actually have a balance that reflects that? And we think that some of the input we've had from our participants in our many workshops really points the way to that and how that might work. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I've left enough time for questions because we'd love to hear from you.